This is a reading from Characters of the Reformation by Hilaire Belloc. Chapter 7. Pope Clement the Seventh. Clement the Seventh was the Pope of King Henry VIII's divorce. He was reigning over the whole space of that affair, being appointed before the King of England had any intention of getting rid of his wife, and dying after the English schism had been virtually completed, and within a very short time of its final and formal completion by the Act of Supremacy. For Henry's idea of getting rid of his legitimate wife, Catherine of Aragon, which idea, as we have seen, was probably more Anne Boleyn's than his own, cannot have arisen at the very earliest before 1525. The first, not absolutely certain, documentary allusion to it is in 1526, and overt action only begins in 1527. Now, Clement the Seventh was elected to the papal throne in 1523. Again, the last political acts by which the separation of England from the unity of the Catholic Church was made certain filled the years 1533 and 34. In 1533, you get the divorce pronounced by Cranmer in spite of the papal prohibition, the marriage with Anne Boleyn acknowledged, and her crowning as queen, the birth of Elizabeth, and the declaration by law of her legitimacy, though she was illegitimate in the eyes of all Europe, and of course in those of ecclesiastical authority. While in the year 1534, you get all the acts one after another which culminated in the complete separation of England from Rome. That was already accomplished before the summer of 1534, and the seal was set upon the whole process by the full Act of Supremacy in the first days of November of that year. For it was the custom of any English Parliament that might be summoned to meet on or just after All Souls' Day. Clement died only 6 weeks earlier, at the end of September in that same year. He is therefore the man in supreme authority during all the period of the divorce and of the schism. Now the prime historical question which his reign arouses is this: could the position have been saved? Could the Pope, by the exercise of certain virtues or certain intellectual qualities in a fashion different from that which he actually showed, have prevented the loss of England to the unity of the faith? It is a question of the very first importance to the whole history of Europe, for, as I am never tired of repeating, if England had not gone, Christendom would still be united, and all Europe would be Catholic today. The answer to this question is not, I think, doubtful. Though Clement was guilty of great weakness and of tortuous policy, though he often sacrificed the spiritual to the temporal, yet he cannot be made responsible for the disaster. Nothing could have prevented the schism save the Pope's pronouncement in favor of a divorce, and that the Pope could not do without flying in the face of the Christian law, of which he was the supreme guardian by the nature of his office. In order to appreciate the truth of all this, let us begin by appreciating who and what Pope Clement was. He was the son of Julian de Medici, who in his turn was the brother of the famous Lorenzo de Medici, that great despot of Florence, generally called Lorenzo the Magnificent, not only one of the wealthiest and one of the most powerful princesses of the Renaissance, but also one of the most striking of the many striking characters of that time. The Medicis were a family which had grown enormously rich in commerce amid a commercial community, their fortunes being undoubtedly helped by many an evil practice, and particularly by usury and oppression. They had become so wealthy that they ranked with reigning sovereigns. John, the second son of Lorenzo, became, through the influence of the Medicean name and its vast financial interests, as also through his own striking character and the excellent training he had had, an obvious candidate for the papacy, as the papacy then was, unfortunately, with its great worldly interests, and overlaid by the idea men had of it, including the popes themselves, that it was not only the supreme head of the church, but an Italian principate. It was this John de Medici, reigning as Leo X, who was pope when the great outbreak in Germany took place. He and his advisors, as we know, misunderstood it, and so the Lutheran movement grew under his reign. His court was splendid, his patronage of the arts glorious and fruitful. He himself was of good life and a scholar, but all that side of his character, eminently fitted for the general and worldly duties of his supreme office, was of worldly influence only. Worldly he was, and worldly wealth and interests did he represent. He kept at his side to help him manage the political side of the church this cousin of his, Julius, the son of his father's brother Julian. Julius de Medici was made cardinal, and was the right-hand man of his cousin Leo X during the reign. After the brief interval of that very fine reforming character, Adrian VI, who, if he had lived, might well have reversed the current and reunited Europe, Julius de Medici was elected at the age of 45 under the title of Clement the Seventh. He was a man of excellent morals, very great erudition, good manners, perfect refinement, if anything, rather too much delicacy of mind and of taste, a splendid patron of the arts, and a sure judge of excellence in them. He was also a remarkably hard worker, taking the tremendous duties of his office most seriously. Moreover, he was as intelligent as any man in Europe. What he lacked was simplicity, also strength of initiative and power of direction. He lacked both those qualities which make for strong command, through what may be called the squareness of a character, and those which make for successful command through the moral simplicity of a character. In the face of a difficult and involved position, his policy became a tangle of secret and involved intrigues, and he had that fatal symptom of weakness which takes the form of always playing for time. There are obviously occasions when playing for time is wise, but Clement the Seventh was one of those men who always play for time, and when they find a decision difficult, say to themselves that with sufficient delay anything may turn up in their favor, and who therefore create delay for its own sake. All his method, from the first mention of the desire for divorce expressed by the English court, up to the very last still hesitating and half-tentative declarations against the actions of the English government, consisted in dependence on delay. For 7 years he played delay as his only card. Nevertheless, for all his weakness and for all his errors, he could not, I repeat, have prevented the disaster, or at least he could only have prevented it at the price of disloyalty to the prestige and power and supernatural claims of the papacy, which it was his first duty to protect. Had he hastened things and pronounced against Henry in as brief a time as could, with decency and the observation of forms have been managed, the schism would still have taken place, because those who were managing the impulsive, sensual, and therefore weak will of the English king were determined to have the divorce, or, if they could not get it, to break with the head of Christendom and have it pronounced upon the local authority of their own servant, the Primate of England. They had behind them not only the will of Anne Boleyn, and later the powerful brain and capacity for rule of Cromwell, but the driving power of a universal greed in the wealthier classes, who were straining at the leash to be let loose upon the property of the Church. I take it that the earliest date on which Clement might have definitely pronounced for or against Henry's claim was late in 1530, or more probably early 1531. In practice, perhaps, considering all the obstacles of form, appeals, and the rest, it might have been impossible before 1532. At any such stage, it would have been too late. To have granted the divorce against justice and ecclesiastical law would have ruined the already shaken papal office, quite apart from the fact that Catherine belonged to the most powerful ruling family of Europe. But it is equally true, and that is what people miss, that if Clement had been a more straightforward man and had pronounced in favor of the Queen at the earlier date and against Henry, it would have already been too late to save England. Henry was already thoroughly and openly in the hands of Anne Boleyn, and already privately in the hands of Thomas Cromwell, with the whole of the English territorial class ready, under the protection of Anne and Cromwell, to spring upon the revenues of religion. It has been the general fashion for your official anti-Catholic historian, both of the English and German Protestant variety, and of the French and Italian anti-clerical variety, to ascribe Clement's reluctance to pronounce in favor of the divorce to the fear and pressure of the great Emperor Charles V, Queen Catherine's nephew and the head of her family. Too many Catholics have been affected by the general trend of the written history around them, and half assented to this idea. It is a false judgment. Clement's mere political intentions during all his reign were obvious enough, and even necessary. His policy was certainly not merely to yield to the powerful emperor, it was rather to play the emperor's power against that of the French king, with whom was in alliance during all the latter part of the business of the government of Henry of England, and thus be independent of both. It is true that he was reconciled with Charles V after having been treated as a virtual prisoner by the irregular troops of that emperor. It is true that after the long double negotiations and the secret support of Charles's rivals, he came to an open agreement and crowned Charles at Bologna in 1530. It is true that of the various great political forces pulling the papacy various ways, the force of Charles V was at the critical moment, 1532, the greatest. But it is not true that it decided the issue. What decided the issue was the necessity that any pope would have been under, strong or weak, straightforward or intriguing, to decide upon the merits of the case. Clement went to the extreme limits of concession to Henry VIII, or rather to those who ran Henry VIII. He went beyond the limits of due and rightful concession. The weakest and most blamable of all his acts was a secret promise that he would not recall the case to Rome, but let it be concluded in Henry's kingdom and under Henry's eye. It is true that this promise was conditional, that Clement left himself a loophole of which he could take advantage, and of which he did take advantage when Catherine lodged her appeal. Still, it was intended to deceive and cause delay, and was an act the more reprehensible on that account. Yet, even with all such concessions, with all his hesitation and chance phrases which seemed to give Henry hope of succeeding, the central fact remained. Catherine had solemnly denied the consummation of the original marriage. She was a woman of high character. She swore she had never been the real wife of Henry's brother, who had died as a boy, and Henry never contradicted her. Proof sufficient to overset that solemn declaration was lacking. There was no sufficient ground upon which to quash the marriage of Catherine with Henry and declare it null, unless Clement had been willing to admit that he was not the supreme judge in a moral case, that is, unless he had been willing to stultify all the claims and position of the papacy. He had himself said in his despair and anxiety that it would be a good thing if the Queen of England were in her grave. He had allowed all manner of suggestions for outflanking the difficulty. He had even considered Catherine's voluntary renunciation, and of course everything would have been made easy if Catherine had consented no longer to press her solemn declaration, or to insist upon her appeal. But, with Catherine making that appeal and taking the position she did, Clement had no choice but to act as he acted, even at the risk of losing England, and perhaps, so delicate was the situation, France, the ally of England, as well. Those who have blamed him most have failed to emphasize his chief grounds for hesitancy and delay, grounds which would have affected even the strongest character. All Christendom appeared to be breaking up, and though England was but a comparatively small and weak power compared with France or the Empire, what side she would take in the universal religious struggle was bound to make all the difference, and the Pope must needs think twice or three times before he determined, however great the moral necessity, to risk the loss of England. We may sum up the situation by saying that if a stronger and more direct mind had been at work in the successor of St. Peter, the English schism would have arrived with less loss of honor and moral authority to Rome. But we must add that much as Clement's weakness and shuffling must be regretted, he never passed the boundary beyond which there is abdication or denial of authority. He never compromised the fundamentals of the papal power and of its awful claim to moral supremacy among men. There is something supernatural in all this. We have always to be careful in history not to exaggerate evidence of the supernatural, nor to ascribe to supernatural causes what may legitimately be ascribed to natural ones. But here there seems to be evidence of supernatural guidance. Just one step too far at one moment in papal history would have compromised the papacy in the eyes of posterity, and have given solid argument against its claims. That moment fell in the reign of Clement the Seventh, and in that moment the papacy did not fail, even though the Pope had sailed so very near the wind. Clement just might, at the most critical moment when he was being hardest pressed, bullied, not knowing what to do between the great contending forces of which he was the victim, he just might, I say, have overstepped the limit. He might, for instance, have issued a bull in which he declared the original papal power of dispensation for marriage with a sister-in-law to be void. He might have got out of his difficulties by allowing the verdict of the universities to be not advisory to the Holy See, but upon an equality with it. He might have taken any one of half a dozen steps, each of which would have been, for the first time, an admission by the Pope that the papacy was not what it was. and by a sufficient margin. Clement happily was preserved from so fatal an excess of weakness. He was preserved from it by that divine safeguarding of the Church which never fails, but he was also preserved from it by that element in him which, for all his faults, remained strong, a recognition of what was essential to his office.